who are dark up and blue. Don't let us hang around this town and let what others say come true. We're just good for nothing. They all feel given. A boy's grown up shiftless jigger.
It should. There we go. I think now we're good. So now this UN resolution that was voted on and adopted on Wednesday, and I just want to give it a couple of minutes to make sure that people can hear. All right, great. On online on video, fantastic. So the UN vote on Wednesday, that was historic, that we need to talk about because there are some aspects to this resolution, and some history, because you know that's my thing, that we need to understand what this resolution means and what it does not. Okay, so let's get into it. On Wednesday, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution declaring the trafficking of enslaved Africans is the gravest crime against humanity and calling for reparations as a concrete step towards remedying historical wrongs. The resolution also urges, and this is reported by the Associated Press, the resolution also urges the prompt and unhindered restitution of cultural items, including artworks, monuments, museum pieces, documents, and national archives, to their countries of origin without charge. Now, I'm going to give you a little aside here. I'm going to be doing that a lot as I'm reading through this article and reading through some of the things I want to share with you. I do love that this resolution calls for the return of stolen artifacts to the countries affected. This is important because one way European nations have continued to profit off of this horrible crime against humanity is that they make money from displaying the artifacts stolen from the communities and people that they stole and that they stole from. At the very least, museums of the enslaving, colonizing countries should not continue to make money from those stolen artifacts. So, yeah, give them back for free at no charge and right now. So, the article in AP goes on to say that the vote in the 193 member world body, that's the United Nations, was 123 to 3 with 52 abstentions. Argentina, Israel, and the United States were the three members voting against the resolution. The United Kingdom and all 27 members of the European Union and their European vassals, compradors, and proxies were those that abstained. Now, while the United States opposes the past wrongdoing of the transatlantic slave trade, or at least that's what they put down on paper and tell the world, and all other forms of slavery, that's a lie. No, they don't. But anyway, they say that this resolution, the United States response to this resolution is in part this quote, the United States does not recognize a legal right to reparations for historical wrongs that were not illegal under international law at the time they occurred. End quote. That is what Deputy U.S. Ambassador Dan Negrea, I want to make sure that you know that his name is Negrea, Negrea, I cannot make this up if I tried, said before the vote. And he went on to say that the United States also strongly objects to the resolution's attempt to rank crimes against humanity in any type of hierarchy. The assertion that some crimes against humanity are less severe than others objectively dismisses the suffering of countless victims and survivors of other atrocities throughout history. End quote. That's what that man said, the representative of the United States. So that is the position of the US government. But here's the thing, y'all. That's what they've been saying about Israel all this time because of the Holocaust, is it not? Europeans ranked their Holocaust higher than the crime against humanity that they are committing against Palestinians, Lebanese, Syrians, and anti Zionists right now. The hashtag never forget, hashtag never again. Oh, yeah, that's great. But that's only for European Jews who use them as an excuse for them to do to Palestinians and whoever else they feel like what the Nazis did to them. So the US is not opposed to ranking crimes against humanity. They've always done it. And they've always done it to protect itself and to protect its baby brother, Israel. But before we get excited and celebrate those reparations that we think are coming through this resolution, here's what we need to understand about the limitations of the resolution. Because unlike the UN Security Council resolutions, General Assembly resolutions are not legally binding, are not. But they are an important reflection of world opinion, and that does matter, even though this resolution cannot be used to force the United States to do anything it doesn't want to do or any other country. World opinion does matter, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But right now, the United Nations said in response to the vote, quote, "Today we come together in solemn solidarity to affirm truth and pursue a route to healing and reparative justice." And this was actually Ghanaian President John Dramani Mahama, who is a key architect of the resolution. This is what he said at the UN about the vote. He went on to say that, quote, "The adoption of this resolution serves as a safeguard against forgetting. Let it be recorded that when history beckoned, we did what was right for the memory of the millions who suffered the indignity of slavery." End quote. Mahama noted that the vote was taking place on the International Day of Remembrance of the victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, honoring the memory of about 13 million African men, women, and children enslaved over several centuries. Several centuries. Diplomats applauded and some cheered the adoption of the resolution. The history of slavery and its devastating consequences and long lasting impacts must never be forgotten, said British acting U.S. Ambassador James Kariuki, speaking on behalf of mainly Western nations, including some that enslaved Africans. Western nations, AP says, are committed to tracking the root causes that persist today. This is what this karaoke person is quoted to have said at the UN, the British dude. He said, pointing to racial discrimination, racism, xenophobia, and intolerance. He said, quote, "The scourge of modern slavery also must be addressed. Trafficking, forced labor, sexual exploitation, and forced criminality." But y'all, folks, do you see how these folks are responding to the Epstein files right now? And I don't just mean the Republicans. How long did Democrats have these documents and did absolutely nothing with them? Have y'all realized yet that if Democrats had investigated and exposed these files and everyone in them before now, or even just a few people before now, this man may not have been able to even run again, let alone win the election? But instead of doing that or admitting that they screwed this up, they blame the youth, black men, black women, progressives, leftists, everybody else for not voting for the genocide supporting black woman who supported genocide under the genocide supporting old white Democrat man. These people are not going to do anything different. with this resolution, folks, that's why I'm bringing this up, than what they are doing right now about everything that we know that the ruling class in this country and in much of Europe and in Israel, obviously, are involved in. Then there was Cyprus's deputy UN ambassador, Gabriela Michailidou. Sorry if I mispronounced that, speaking on behalf of the European Union that abstained, echoed the US and the UK on concerns about the use of superlatives that imply a hierarchy among atrocity crimes. They really need to be quiet, because I don't know that anybody outdoes the United States in atrocity crimes other than, I don't know, maybe the British? Anyway, the Europeans are a trip, y'all. The same people have been using the Nazi Holocaust of Jews as the worst atrocity in human history, as a sledgehammer to punish and silence anyone who criticizes Israel for acting like the people who carried out a genocide against them in Palestine. This hypocrisy of typical pan-European ruling class arrogance, believing that they get to decide what crimes the world should oppose and which ones they should ignore, because of course their crimes should be ignored. That's always their response. But this representative of the EU also cited their concern about the resolution's, quote, unbalanced interpretation of historical events, end quote, and legal references that are inaccurate or inconsistent with international law, including, quote, suggestions of a retroactive application of international rules, which was non existent at the time, and claims for reparations, end quote, quote. You notice how the US rejection of the resolution and the European Union rejection of the resolution rest on the exact same arguments? Well, it wasn't illegal then. How can you apply laws that didn't exist? You, mm-hmm. The unbalanced interpretation of historical events line, that's always going to be white people's excuse for refuting their history of oppression of hundreds of millions of people. If it didn't happen the way they say it happened, then as far as they're concerned, it didn't happen. Or it just wasn't as bad as we keep saying it was. We're always over exaggerating. Oh my God, we're so dramatic. It wasn't that bad. You survived, didn't you? Somebody actually said that to me one day. We were talking about the actual history of slavery, and this person really got angry at me, and her response was, a white lady too. Well, you survived, didn't you? It wasn't that bad. Oh, but these people lie to themselves about what they did. So, no, they're never going to admit their guilt. And getting someone who refuses to admit that they're wrong to pay for those wrongs, how would we do that? In the system that they built off of the profits of the crimes they refuse to admit they committed, abetted, or profited from, and that they won't even admit were crimes, right? Then there's the bit about the retroactive application of international rules, which was non existent back then. Basically, they're saying that they can't be made to pay now for crimes that were not legally considered crimes when the actions occurred. And that's a wild argument to me, considering entire nation, the Western Hemisphere, but countries like Cyprus and the United States, Canada, Britain, France, Belgium got filthy, stinking rich off of those actions and continue to benefit from the profit and power those actions produced for them, as did hundreds of thousands of businesses that are pillars of capitalism in these countries today, like insurance and actuary companies, real estate companies, colleges and universities, museums, and even churches. These institutions and nations can continue to benefit from the profit made from the exploitation and complete dehumanization of tens of millions of Africans, and continue to grow those riches to infinite levels, along with the power that comes with it, while the vast majority of the descendants of those Africans and other oppressed people in the global South that they colonized and enslaved continue to be denied equality and justice, economic, political, and social equality in their societies. And furthermore, I will continue to make the argument that even if man's law validated slavery at one time in these countries, and of course we know that it did, human rights, basic human decency, and the laws of the God these people claim they serve, because they're always swearing up and down that they're Christians and their nations are Christian nations and they follow the Christian God. Yeah, okay. If that were true, how did they think that enslaving other people was a good thing? They ignored those laws too. And then when those man-made laws changed, it wasn't like these nations, institutions, and individuals stopped their unjust, inhumane practices immediately just because now it was illegal, centuries after it was allowed to continue. No, we need to stop playing with this idea that they care about some law. They never have. Look at all of these people now supporting genocides, talking about human trafficking. To enslave people wasn't a crime then. They knew it was wrong. It was just that profit and bias was more important than humanity, decency, equality, and justice. And that is still true of many of them. We need to keep that in mind. But then on top of that, for those of us in this country who think this is going to matter here, this resolution, politically, I mean, this administration just a few weeks ago put out a call for white men to apply for compensation for discrimination claims. Yes, that actually happened. The American regime under Trump, as early as this year, a few weeks ago, if not a month ago, has targeted diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, obviously calling them discriminatory, against white men. He signed an executive order in April last year to eliminate DEI, or disparate impact liability, as well, which was aimed at restructuring how workplace discrimination is investigated and litigated. And then Andrea Lucas, an Equal Employment Opportunity Commission commissioner appointed by Trump, advised white men who experience discrimination based on race or sex to apply to seek compensation. That just happened. Now, those efforts might not be reparations for white people, but they do expose the attitude among many Americans about racial inequality and injustice, and should have been an indication, if you knew about it, that the US would never vote for a resolution like this. The AP article continues to describe that the resolution, quote, unequivocally condemns the trafficking of enslaved Africans and racialized chattel enslavement of Africans, slavery, and the transatlantic slave trade as the most inhumane and enduring injustice against humanity, end quote. That's language directly from the resolution. And of course, Europeans would be opposed to this resolution and that language because they don't want to, and they never will admit that what they did to Africans and the global South in general continues to have enduring, lasting, damaging impact on the descendants of those people. Their current policies with and about those countries are direct results of their colonial or comprador proxy histories with those countries. If they admit that there is still injustice and equality in their societies based on the legacy of slavery, then they validate the argument for specific, targeted redress to relieve the affected descendants. You see how that works and why they don't ever want to do it? And by the way, when I say Europe, I am including the United States because that's where they came from. That's where the people who colonized here, they came from Europe. They're Europeans. Yeah. And Israel as well. Also Europeans. The AP article continues: in approving the resolution, the General Assembly of the United Nations affirms the importance of addressing the historical wrongs of slavery that promotes, quote, justice, human rights, dignity, and healing, end quote. But Europeans don't want any of that. Come on. They can't profit off of that stuff. Yet, capitalists do not want any of those things. They want to keep making their private super profits off the continued exploitation that system of chattel slavery created, and that this country was built on, and all of their countries was built on. They will not willingly share any of it for our justice. They don't care about us or justice or history or decency or dignity. We need to get this straight. There is no appealing to their morality because they have none. The resolution, the AP article says, calls on UN member nations to engage in talks, quote, on reparatory justice, including a full and formal apology, measures of restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, guarantees of non repetition, and changes to laws, programs, and services to address racism and systemic discrimination. That is what the resolution says. It encourages voluntary contributions to promote education on the transatlantic slave trade and asks the African Union, the Caribbean Community, and the Organization of American States to collaborate with UN bodies and other nations, quote, on reparatory justice and reconciliation, end quote. Okay, here's where the problems are showing up. Here it is. Because anybody who understands imperialism should want at least one of those organizations, and maybe one of the other two, should want those organizations to collaborate with. You don't want to collaborate with the OAS on reparations and reconciliation. The African Union can be messy too, and sometimes CARICOM is a mess. But to the credit of the African Union and CARICOM, see, CARICOM has been pushing global reparations for a while, and the African Union has joined into the call. The Organization of the American States, yeah, no, not the US imperialist organization of the imperialist American states. No, they don't want to do that. Because those organizations, well, that one in particular, the the OAS, and sometimes some member states of the African Union pander to the US, EU, and NATO too much. And the OAS is one of those imperialist alphabet soft power entities from this country that interferes in other countries' elections, then lies about them being invalid or rigged by the left leaning candidate or party, which then triggers further intervention by other US agencies and eventually the military in support of right wing US friendly regimes, not actual democracy. These entities can't be fully trusted by the people to act on their behalf. Either the people lead these conversations and processes, or they will end up being failed efforts that will be used in the future to say that reparations are too hard. We tried, but look at what happened. Last time, let's just move on now. The people must lead these efforts. Now is the time for the People's Senate. And maybe it's time for you to check out the Spirit of Mandela Coalition at spiritofmandela.org. That's SPIRITOFMANDELA.org. Now, I know that in this country, reparations has always been a controversial, heated, unresolved topic. It has always been this way ever since Queen Mother Audley Moore practically began the modern reparations movement in the early 60s. She started it, an anti imperialist, pan African organizer in the 60s. And it's only gotten worse, this fight over reparations, over the past few years, with some unfortunate right wing influence perspectives on the topic that have made inroads into the Black community. And among those folks who call themselves ADOS or FBA, American Descendants of Slaves, or Foundational Black Americans, or whatever Black people who believe they are more likely to get reparations in this country if they associate and identify themselves as American and not African at all. I hope that since the country that introduced this resolution is Ghana, yeah, Ghana introduced this resolution, that these folks who believe that they are not African, I hope they feel like they're not compelled to use this resolution now adopted resolution in the UN, to make any part of their claim valid, because look, they're not African, right? So, since it was an African nation that introduced this resolution for global reparations from every country that participated in the transatlantic slave trade and chattel slavery, so, because these folks are not African, they should not want to have anything to do with this resolution, right? I keep getting my two words confused because, oh, so close. Because, like I said they aren't African. They said they are American. So the fact that 153 countries led by every nation in Africa voted for the coordinated international response to address this historic wrong that put us in this nation shouldn't matter to them, right? They should completely ignore this. The only thing that they have repeatedly said is that they are not African. So they should fully accept and work with the response to this resolution that was issued by their country, right? And the United States, the country they say they are aligned with, not African, along with Israel and Argentina, voted against this resolution. So Americans who believe in and support American values and the American way should support America's vote against this resolution, right? That's just logical to me. But what I think people need to understand is that the head of this regime, this current head of this regime, is not the first US president to oppose reparations, and he will not be the last. I can say that because history has shown that. Opposition to reparations is US policy. In 2009, the US Senate passed a resolution, and a similar House measure was passed, officially apologizing for slavery and Jim Crow laws, specifically stating, however, that the apology cannot be used to support legal claims, lawsuits, or demands for reparations against the US government. This non binding apology from 2009 was intended for reconciliation, whatever the heck that is in the context of this place, not financial restitution. So the text of the apology from 2009 explicitly disclaims any authorization for legal claims against the United States. The resolution, like the one passed at the UN, is non-binding. It's a symbolic act of an apology, not a legal basis for one. And while some activists and lawmakers like Congressman Jim Conyers, the late Congressman John Conyers, continued to push for reparations for 40 years, HR 40, that was the late Representative John Conyers. The official apology was passed specifically to avoid being a legally binding admission of liability and guilt. So the apology acknowledges the fundamental injustice, cruelty, brutality, and inhumanity of slavery. It actually says that, but it does not accept legal liability. I know that a lot of people um, may not know about that history, that the US, yes, it did issue apologies for slavery, but those apologies explicitly denied the ability to use said apologies in legal claims for reparations. So while some consider the apology a confession that should lead to reparations, the text itself prevents its use as a legal tool. That is very important for us to understand. This country's government at the federal level has already and repeatedly made the case that, yeah, okay, we'll apologize for slavery. But we have already said that we are not going to accept responsibility for the harm done, and you cannot sue us and make us pay you for the harm that continues to be done. I'm not saying that these things can never be overturned, but since these apologies, these official apologies for slavery, have been issued by the US government, they haven't been legally overturned. This is important to understand. But we are just at 30 minutes past the hour. So let's take a little break because I know we all need a breather and see what's going on in the WPFW universe this week. So, engineer extraordinaire, what do we have on tap for the people today? There is a profound connection between Billie Holiday and Paul Robeson. Both were pioneering Black artist activists who utilized their immense talents to challenge American racism, becoming influential voices against oppression. Despite working in different musical genres, both bridged art and activism to confront the socio-political climate of their time, ultimately sacrificing their careers and facing persecution for their political stances. On Wednesday, April 8th from 12 a.m. to midnight, we will celebrate their immense talent, resistance, and sacrifice with From Strange Fruit to Joe Hill, the paralleling artistry and activism of Billie Holiday and Paul Robeson. This special day of pre-drive fundraising programming will center the contributions of these icons of the 20th century. WPFW, building a more equitable world, one broadcast at a time. Wow, that was me again. And that was a little bit of a shock because I didn't know that they were going to play me again. So that was very interesting. Thank you so much. And I hope you tune in for that program. And it really is going to be a fantastic tribute to those two giants of liberatory art. It's just a wonderful way that this station honors our history. So I really appreciate that WPFW does that as we honor our history by, talking about our history, because various state legislatures have also issued public apologies for slavery in the United States. Like on February 24th, 2007, the Virginia General Assembly, and man, they really needed to issue, but they issued, passed up the House Joint Resolution number 728, acknowledging, quote, with profound regret, the involuntary servitude of Africans and the exploitation of Native Americans, and call for reconciliation among all Virginians, end quote. Yeah, okay. That didn't do anything either. With the passing of that resolution, Virginia did become the first state to acknowledge through the state's governing body their state's negative involvement in slavery. I mean, if you know the history of Virginia, you can't really ignore it. But the passing of that resolution was in anticipation of the 400th anniversary commemoration of the founding of Jamestown, Virginia, which was the first permanent English settlement in North America, which was, guess what, an early colonial slave port. Apologies like this have also been issued by Alabama, California, Florida, Maryland, New Jersey, and North Carolina. There have been, or there is, some state level action in regard to reparations programs because federal apologies, as we have just talked about on the other side of the break, have not led to reparations. And in this current system, I am sorry to tell you, they are not going to. But some municipalities and local governments have, in separate efforts, taken steps towards some kind of reparations programs. And these state level efforts are, of course, under attack. Like as of March 2026, California and Illinois are advancing reparations efforts. California is focusing on legislation following its 2023 task force report, including establishing a bureau for descendants. Illinois has launched a state commission to develop legislative proposals based on a newly released report outlining the historic harms alongside localized payments. California, a reparations situation is that they're pushing new bills aimed at implementing the recommendations of their what was that, the commission, the reparations task force, and that 2023 report. But now I have to say something that people are not going to like about their new Democratic favorite, Gavin Newsom. Governor Newsom vetoed several high profile bills in 2025, last year, that would have offered housing and education benefits to some of those descendants, citing legal risks. However, he did sign measures to create, as if this is somehow better. He signed measures to create a bureau for descendants to verify ancestry for future reparations, dedicating significant funding for implementation in 2025-26. So look, in a typical liberal move, Gavin Newsom dedicates money to creating a commission, a working group, or whatever, but nothing to relieve the suffering of the people enduring the continued legacy of the crime against humanity that was carried out against their ancestors right now. That's Gavin Newsom for you. And that's also the Democrats, who they are setting up to be their 2028 nominee. I just want you to keep that in mind. That's all. Los Angeles County is continuing its local reparations studies and initiatives based on the statewide task force proposals. And over in Illinois, the Illinois African Descendant Citizens Reparation Commission released a comprehensive report in March of this year, it was a few weeks ago, documenting historical harms against Black residents, serving as a foundation for proposed legislation. The ADCRC is actively working on developing reparative justice legislative proposals focusing on economic restoration. And Evanston, Illinois, continues its landmark program, having distributed $25,000 cash payments to Black residents to address housing inequalities, despite legal challenges. Imagine that. You get threatened by white supremacists that they're going to sue you if you give reparations to the descendants of enslaved people, and you decide, well, okay, sue us anyway, but you can't make us not give them this money. Wow. Imagine that. Imagine having the power to do that and then choosing not to. In Chicago, the city is currently appointing members to a 25-member reparations task force. That task force is designed to fail because if it's got that many people on it, oh my God, they ain't gonna get nothing done. But anyway, yes, they're setting up this 25-member reparations task force to study the legacy of slavery. But honestly, nobody needs to study the legacy of slavery anymore. We all the study has been done, the documentation has been done. It's there, it's out there. All we have to do anyway. All we have to do is destroy this system, and that's where I'm getting to the utility of this UN resolution. If it can't be used to force the governments of these countries to actually take up the recommendations in the resolution, because excuse me, scroll down. This isn't even the first time the United Nations has taken up the issue of racism And this is not the first time that the United States and Israel showed their behind at the UN on this issue of us and justice. Because the United States and Israel walked out of the 2001 UN World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa. That was on September 3rd, 2001, because they were protesting against members of the UN correctly identifying all the way back in 2001, y'all. Members of the UN member states identified Israel and Zionism as racist. They literally said Zionism, what Israel is doing in Palestine, is apartheid, just like what was done to us here in South Africa. There must be language that the UN adopts to define Zionism as racism and to define Israel as an apartheid state. Colin Powell, the leader of the US delegation, led the US delegation out of the conference. They literally stood up and walked out of the conference. And they said that the conference became a quote unquote festival of hate because they accurately described Israel as an apartheid state and Zionism as a racist political ideology, focusing heavily on anti-Israel rhetoric. That's why they called it a festival of hate rather than broader human rights. So we can exclude the human rights of the Palestinians that the white supremacist settler colonial apartheid ethno state of Israel violated every day for over 100 years. We can exclude their human rights. We don't have to talk about those as long as we talk about everybody else's human rights. But they're also not going to talk about our human rights. Right? Yeah. So this 2001 US walkout happened because a draft document singled out Israel as a racist state and sought to define Zionism as a form of racism. The ADL didn't like that. The Israel lobby didn't like that, all that kind of stuff. The protests against Israel, because I think they carried out a massacre right before this conference. So there were protests against Israel's actions, which of course Israel called anti-Semitic. The literature at describing Israel as an apartheid state based on South Africa's history, that was mischaracterized as anti-Semitic and hateful literature, which Congressman Tom Lantos at the time described as the most appalling anti-Semitic display since the Nazi period. These people have been on this mess for a long time. As a result, the U.S. and Israel withdrew from the Durban Conference, the UN Global Conference on Racism in Durban, South Africa in 2001, though the conference concluded with the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. You're going to have to look that up, and we'll talk about it one day, but not going to be able to talk about it right now. But the U.S. and several European nations also boycotted the 2009 follow-up review conference, Durban 2, over concerns of alleged anti-Semitism. You can't attack Israel, actively carrying out a genocide, actively imposing a Jewish supremacist, European Jewish supremacist apartheid. And that was the stance of the United States in 2001. And you think they're going to give us, okay. But look at where the world is today, because the US delegation, led by a whole Black man, had a hissy fit over telling the truth about Israel in 2001. Oh, and I have to add this about our connection with Africans and Africa and what people around the world think of African Americans and how people believe we don't have any friends. Not only did 153 countries, mostly in the global south, vote without hesitation in favor of this resolution, but I want to read this article written by Don Rojas that I think is a perfect way to end this show today that answers this concern. This article is called "Africans Have Apologized for Slavery, So Why Won't the U.S.?" This article reads thusly: 5 years ago, I stood in a slave castle on Senegal's Goree Island at the infamous door of no return. Our guide told us that once Africans walked through this doorway, which opened right into the Atlantic Ocean, they were gone forever. During the slave trade, shackled blacks were let out the door and forced onto ships that waited on the other side. If a slave tried to turn back, he could be shot and fed to the sharks that loitered nearby. After the group had moved on, I lingered a few minutes and wondered if any of my ancestors walked through this door on the way to a life of brutal enslavement. Just then, a Senegalese man walked up to me and asked if I was American. When I told him I was, he put his hand on my shoulder and, with his voice cracking with emotion, said, "I'm sorry, brother." 5 years ago this week, this article was written in 2014, just months after Barack Obama took office, the Senate unanimously passed a resolution apologizing for slavery. The Senate acknowledged the fundamental injustice, cruelty, brutality, and inhumanity of slavery and apologized to African Americans on behalf of the people of the United States for the wrongs committed against them and their ancestors who suffered under slavery. The House of Representatives had passed a similar measure the previous year, but Congress could not resolve the two apologies because of differing views on how the resolution would be used in any discussion of reparations. The Senate version was insistent that an apology would not endorse any future claims. The House could not agree. Significantly, the Office of the President of the United States has never issued an apology, not even under Obama. In other words, the United States has never given an unconditional apology for slavery. For a nation that can't even agree on an apology, the recent conversation around reparations could be seen as little more than an exercise in oratory. It's a little absurd that I had to travel across the Atlantic Ocean to West Africa to hear the words, "Sorry, brother." As it turns out, mine was not a singular event. Many West African nations and tribes have issued apologies for their role in the transatlantic slave trade to Black Americans and even to specific African American individuals who have traced their ancestry to certain locales and who would otherwise have never received an apology. In 1999, the president of Benin, a neighbor of Nigeria, apologized for his nation's role in slavery. In 2006, Ghana apologized to American descendants of slaves, which is also incredibly important considering it is Ghana that issued the resolution. A few months ago, a Cameroonian chieftain apologized to an African American who traced his lineage to a couple of local clans. Other West African tribal leaders have done the same. The reason for these apologies is the role that some West African tribes and clans played in trading away people from neighboring tribes that they'd captured in war or had kidnapped. Though this may appear to have been Africans selling Africans, Rojas says, into slavery, it was not that simple. As many scholars have noted, calling all participants African presumes a unified identity among captors and captives that did not exist during the transatlantic slave trade. So we can't apply laws that didn't exist to crimes that were not dedicated as crimes back then. We can't do that retroactively, but we can call everybody African today who didn't see themselves as African then to make the argument that Africans sold each other. The hypocrisy is blinding. It's blinding. Different tribes saw themselves as completely distinct and held no inherent loyalties to one another, just as people today in Montreal, Mexico City, and Washington, D.C. do not see one another as American brothers simply because they sit on the same continent, although that is changing. But this is what Don Rojas wrote in 2014. However, many West African nations feel compassion and a sense of responsibility for among those who did participate in this, for the descendants of those taken from African soil. They recognize the atrocity and the complicity of some of their ancestors in allowing it to occur. That is an interesting statement because much of the guilt doesn't really involve the mass involvement of hundreds of Africans complicit in this. A lot of the guilt is we didn't stop it. It just allowing it to occur. And so they've apologized for all of it without condition. The United States, on the other hand, Rojas writes, has not. Though it has formally apologized for the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II and compensated them with reparations, but the way that was done was a terrible, terrible mess. And yes, the U.S. government ripped those people off, but and yes, they apologized for subjecting Black men to syphilis research during the Tuskegee experiment. The nation has not mustered the will to do the same for slavery. And I must add here, and this is not in the article, it's just me, that when the Africans apologized, they didn't excuse their ancestors' behaviors who were complicit in the trade. They didn't argue that it wasn't all of their ancestors, even though it actually was not, just a greedy and selfish few. They didn't say it wasn't entirely their fault because the Europeans outgunned them. And they didn't exactly ask nicely when they said, no, we're not going to do this, even though that is true. The Africans who apologized simply apologized and embraced their kin, embraced us. But we keep believing that they hate us so much because we keep believing the lies. The people whose ancestors enslaved us have told us about them to do exactly what people today are doing, separating ourselves from our relatives on the continent of Africa. Rojas continues the article saying, and it's not just the government. In a recent Huffington Post YouGov poll, remember this was in 2014, only 28% of Americans thought that slavery warranted an apology, while 54% thought the country should not apologize. 18% had no opinion. In other words, it's not the will of the American people or the government to apologize for slavery. This is a significant declaration and communicates to Black Americans what the nation thinks of their story. The result of recent polling on the topic of reparations have not produced any more positive results. A 2021 Pew Research Center survey found that 77% of Black Americans support reparations compared to only now 18% of white Americans. Democrats are more likely, and more likely is 50%, to connect current national wealth to slave labor compared to Republicans, and that's 15% of Republicans. In California, a 2023 poll showed a 2-to-1 margin against cash reparations, even as the Reparations Commission is active right now. But Americans don't want to know the truth about slavery either. Only about 49% of Americans believe schools have a responsibility to teach about the ongoing effects of slavery, while 41% believe only the history should be taught, not its current implications. Most Americans simply do not care about teaching the true history of this nation in regard to slavery or anything else. And if that's true of slavery, then what do you think that means about indigenous genocide? The abuse of immigrants, of racialized immigrants, Japanese internment, gender violence, and everything else. That shows that this country has never been a place where all men are created and treated equally. So, of course, there's spotty knowledge among the public regarding specific historical details like the 13th Amendment, the Freedmen's Bureau, 40 acres and a mule, the race massacres, the destruction of Black communities, the land theft, the lynching, and everything that was taken from us in the process. Rojas ends his article with this: As a Black man and military officer, I was especially proud to see President Obama and the First Lady stand in the door of no return when they visited Goree Island. The visual of our first Black president standing in the spot which symbolizes the victimization and subjugation of generations of Black people was incredibly powerful. But for me, what is just as significant is that on the very spot where my commander in chief stood, a man from another country said the words that the nation I love and defend will not say. That's what Don Rojas said. And he ended with, here's hoping the incentive to apologize will take the same course from Africa to US shores as many Blacks did centuries ago. Well, it hasn't happened. It hadn't in the years of Obama's presidency, it hadn't in the years after, and it will not now. So, what does this UN resolution declaring African chattel slavery the worst crime against humanity mean if it's not legally binding and the UN can't force any country to do anything with or about it? What it does for us is tell us that we are seen by the global South as part of the global South. We are seen by European nations and their allies and proxies as the servants and the slaves that they turned us into when they colonized and enslaved our ancestors all over the global South and everywhere else. I think this vote is a clear indication for us that the opinion of the world is that there is a struggle between the colonized and the colonizers and their comprador states that abstained with them because the whole EU abstained, that we have been sitting on the sidelines of for too long. I think we use this vote to advance that hopefully newly understood unity in struggle, international solidarity in struggle among working class, poor, oppressed, colonized people of the global South and the global North, and strengthen those connections to advance this struggle, grow it, and win. I think we take the expression of solidarity with us from the global South and other anti colonial leading nations like Russia and China that voted for this resolution, that I believe this vote represents at face value, and align ourselves with kin and collaborators to begin building the better world we all deserve. That is how we will get reparations, I believe. When we anti imperialists say that we will not get reparations from this current capitalist imperialist system, we don't mean reparations are impossible. What we mean is exactly what we say. We will not get reparations from these people in this system that is designed never to treat us justly. What we mean is that we will get our justice in every form when we take this system over and change it into what we want and need it to be. That is how we will realize reparations and international solidarity with the people of the global South and the rest of the world who just voted to let us know that they are with us is how we are going to accomplish that. I'm out of time. Thank you so much for joining me here on Darker Than Blue this evening. I will see you again next week with, I hope, to be someone from Venezuela to talk to us about what's really going on there. But until then, our luta continua, the struggle continues. But if we keep fighting, learning the history, telling the truth, and being dialectical materialists, Victoria acerta. Victory is certain. Peace.
We
Oh, whoops. I don't know what happened here. What's going on? Okay, there we go. Just a few minutes. Just gonna stick around a few minutes, y'all, because I know I owe you. I owe you some extra time because I haven't been able to do it. Excuse me. Over the past couple of weeks. I guess I don't have a whole hell of a lot to say because I tried to say it all because this is just, I think this is one of those topics that I don't want to have a whole bunch of conversations about because we have talked about this issue of reparations and the history and the damage and the harm and all of this good stuff for decades, for decades. And we got people coming in, literally new kids on the block, children coming in here telling us, you don't know what you're talking about. Y'all ain't done shit. Who the fuck is Malcolm X? He a tether. Who the fuck is this? He a tether. Fuck, fuck Marcus Garvey. He ain't American. Like, motherfucker. When the entire topic of reparations was not brought up by them, and they wouldn't have had a conversation to hijack were it not for Queen Mother Moore back in 1962, who they didn't even recognize as important. And that foolishness has metastasized into people saying weird shit like the Middle Passage didn't actually happen. It didn't happen because you can't get a boat. The Atlantic Ocean is so violent that no boat can pass the. I'm not kidding. And Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth didn't even exist. This the depths of the Black nativist discourse, um and the plunge into irrational, ahistorical, illogical, absolute ignorance is both a result of the anti-intellectualism that has been institutionalized in the US, but it is also a result of the ease with which social media popularized right-wing narratives that people were able to pick up on. And because anti-intellectualism is already so accepted, you just believe anything anybody says that on a TikTok, you're sitting right there on the internet and you won't even look it up. Oh my God. And yes, the AI is just gonna make it work. We I I do not, I don't know what to do about that group of folks. I'm not sure that there is anything that can be done with those group of folks. I think just like everybody else, people will at some point realize that they were wrong about these things, but at that point, I don't think it's I don't think it's going to matter in regard to what they do in relation to the larger struggle for liberation, because that's the other kind of issue that I have, that I try to be kind of careful about, because I don't like to make it seem like I am dismissing the demand for reparations. I'm not. What we anti-imperialists are saying is that the struggle cannot be just for reparations, because if you if reparations is your only focus, what are you going to do about housing, healthcare, education? Do you see what I mean? If you receive, and here's the thing, if you receive reparations, any kind of, I don't care what I don't care if it's cash, I don't care if it's education, I don't care if it's, housing or whatever it is. If you receive reparations in a system that is still controlled by the white supremacist, pan-European, neoliberal, finance capital dictatorship, pedophile ruling class, why do you think that is going to produce justice? Because all that's going to happen is that we're going to get whatever it is we get. And then the people who run this system, who rule this system, capitalists, they are going to adjust the system to accommodate the extra whatever it is we have, so that we remain exactly where we are in the socioeconomic environment of this system. So they will, yeah, if something weird some bizarre thing happens and somebody goes, okay, fine, let's give them reparations. We can just shut them up and, okay, fine. And we each get $50,000. 40, what is it? 44 million of us, men, women, children, 44 million or so in the United States. And let's say they give each of us 50,000. I know that's a low ball amount. That's insulting, but it's an example. Do you think that 50,000, first of all, they're not going to give us an amount of money that is actually going to change our material conditions? That's the first one. That's the first issue. If we think that once they calculate everything that was taken from us, stolen from us, denied from us, denied us, all of this kind of stuff, and adjust the value to match today's inflation, and that value for each person, for 44 million people, may come out to a payment of $1.5 million. You think they're gonna give us that $1.5 million? They're not going to give us that $1.5 million. They're going to find a reason why $1.5 million is too much. How do I know that's true? That's what they did with the Japanese. People always say, well, the Japanese got reparations. It's true, they did. But the Reagan administration cut them in half. And I have to look up what the argument was, but basically it was racism. It was just, we're not giving them all of that, because the Japanese asked for, if it wasn't double, I'm sure it was triple. They asked for a lot more for each survivor and each surviving family of the Japanese interned. Because here's the thing, y'all, the US government didn't just, snatch people off the street and intern them into these camps, these concentration camps in the United States during World War II. Japanese Americans, they stole their homes. They yanked these people out of their homes. You heard the story yesterday, I think it was, that Israel uh kicked 15 families out of their homes in Lebanon. The United States did that to Japanese Americans during World War II. So largely in California, uh-huh. The Chinatown and the Asian district, where there was a whole Japanese neighborhood. The white people took those houses after the US Army came and dragged those people out of their homes into internment camps. So the US government and white US citizens did the same thing to the Japanese that the US government and white US citizens did to our ancestors, did to the indigenous. And when it came to the Japanese finally getting reparations, because they fought and they fought and they fought and they fought and they would not let it go. And it took decades, it took decades. They did not get what they demanded. They got much less than what they demanded. And they were basically told, now go the fuck away and leave us alone. That's what happened with Japanese reparations, or reparations to the Japanese Americans for their internment. So, and then of course there's the issue of reparations to the North American or the European survivors of the Jewish Holocaust who moved to the US. They There are no conditions, as far as I know, on that. Yes, and the US government still pays the few survivors who are left and their families reparation. Yeah, they do. Uh-huh. So if there is a legal argument to be made, and I'm not a lawyer, but I'm just saying, why not bring up the two instances where reparations have been paid and point out that, number one, yeah, you can do it, but if you're going to do it this way, this is wrong. But why would you do it this way when you don't, there are nothing, this is not a problem. What's that about? And the purpose for doing that is not to force them to give you it, because it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. But the purpose for doing that is to put it out there in public, on the record. That is the purpose for doing that. if you're going to continue to pursue this in a legal way outside of organizing for a full blown revolution, which is that's how the Afro Cubans got their reparations. That's how the Afro Venezuelans got theirs. That's how the Afro Nicaraguans got theirs. Hmm. So when we say that, this system, you're not going to get reparations in this system, we're not saying that, reparations is illegitimate. We're saying that these people don't give a shit. We're saying, how can you look at the history of the way this government, this country has responded, not just to our demands for reparations, but to our very existence? How do you figure these people are going to make anything right in regard to us when they won't even admit that crimes were committed by them? So, and I think, as I wrap up, I don't want to have this, I don't want to entertain this conversation about anymore about, oh, we're not African. Okay, you're not African, fine. You are an American, and that puts you on the other side of the barricade for me. It's just, you declare your allegiance, I am going to believe you, and I am going to look at you as the enemy now, because there's no reason to align yourself not only with an empire, but an empire that has already colonized and invaded and occupied and exploited the much of the global south and the western and some of the western hemisphere, but wants to recolonize. Why would you align yourself with people who want to continue to exploit other people who look like us, so they can keep making more money that they are not going to share with you under any circumstance? Look at all these genocides going on right now. War on Iran. The oil barons are making more money. The tech sector is making more money. Has anybody said, we should raise the minimum wage? Look at all this money. Has anybody said, we should establish social housing. We should establish a public commons so people could have a public place to just come and enjoy. And we really should look into implementing universal health care, because these people have been harassing us about this shit all this time. Let's just go ahead and do it with all this money that we're making, because we can afford it now. We can afford it now, right? Except that's not ever going to happen. So this discussion on reparations, for me as an anti-imperialist, yes, I do think this UN resolution is very important, because it does reflect the opinions of the rest of the world about a particular issue, right? And I know that kind of sounds like, these UN General Assembly resolutions are almost like global polls, as opposed to, actionable policy, because, like I said, the UN really cannot make the United States do anything that it suggests or recommends that the US or any EU or aligned country doesn't want to do. How do I know that's true? Who has stopped the genocide in who what did the UN do in regard to the occupation of Palestine? The decades of massacres, the rape prisons. What did what has the United Nations did? But they just sent troops to Haiti, though, to combat the gangs. Yeah. So the United Nations itself is a problematic imperialist institution that we shouldn't entirely trust, because they have screwed us over so many times just as badly as these settler colonial pan-European white supremacist countries. But as true as all of those internal contradictions are about this discussion, about this resolution, it is important for us to know what the rest of the world thinks about us and about this issue. I really do believe this vote reflects that the rest of the world understands that we are all in the same boat because we have all been abused and exploited and stolen from our homes or forced from our homes and murdered and raped and degraded by the same group of people. I think this vote recognizes or conveys to us, or should convey to us, our enemies are their enemies. Their enemies are our enemies. We have to work together to defeat our enemy, our common enemy. And I think it is very important that we got to see what the rest of the world thinks, not just about us, but about our position in a so called advanced developed society that is supposed to exist in a so-called free country that is the beacon of liberation for the world. I think this vote is the rest of the world putting on paper, or at least on the, the display board at the UN. I think this vote is the rest of the world calling bullshit on all of the US's and all of Europe's uh ideological lies and arrogance. I think the question for me is, are we going to take up the call that I believe that a lot of anti imperialists believe this vote conveys for us? I think the world has told us that they are with us. I am wondering, are we going to be with the rest of the world? So that's all I got to say for tonight. Thank you so much. I was hoping to have a young brother from the Simon Bolivar Institute in Venezuela, who I met when I was there, on the show tonight, but he couldn't do this evening, so he'll probably be on next week. And I am going to work on um, getting someone to come and talk about the Congo. And I'm going to try very hard to get Professor Morandi on. We used to interview Professor Morandi all the time on By Any Means Necessary. And I really have been wanting to talk to him for a while since all of this has happened, but I'm going to try to get him on. Um, and let's see, what else was I trying to do? There's something else I was trying to do that I really wanted to tell you about, but now I can't remember what it is. So I think that's time for me. That's a good indication for me to get off of here and go eat dinner. So thank y'all so much. Listen, please support me on Patreon, Luke Mon Nation. Patreon / Luke Mon Nation. You know how it goes. Whatever. LuqMannation. I am tired. It's been a rough week. I hope you all have a fantastic weekend. I hope it's going to be nice. If it is, go outside, get some sun, and I'll see you next week. Luta continua. Yep. Doesn't end, but Victoria Acerta. If we don't stop fighting, I promise we will win. But if we don't fight, we are guaranteed to lose. All right. Peace.